Okay, welcome back to the Neuroethics Learning Collaborative and the lecture on, the second lecture on brain enhancement, mood and personality enhancement. Just to preview where we're going to go, we're going to revisit the therapy versus enhancement distinction. We're going to talk about selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and as with the stimulants, do they work and how do they work as enhancers? Also, like we did in the previous lecture, we'll talk about drugs other than this first class that could be used to enhance mood and personality, and finally discuss the ethical, legal, and social issues. So a good starting point for mood and personality enhancement is the book by Peter Kramer called Listening to Prozac. This is a wonderful book. I recommend it to all of you. Basically one quote that kind of expresses a lot of what the book is a meditation on is this: the self and how it fares in a world where personality is understood as biological and subject to biological influence is a central issue for our time. Who are we if we can be so altered by medication? And why should the medicated self on occasion feel more true than the unmedicated? So a couple of misconceptions, I think, that people who haven't read the book have about the book is Kramer was not promoting SSRIs for enhancement in this book. I think, my impression, and I think the impression of a lot of people before they read the book, is that this was a, yay SSRIs, these are great, everybody should take them book. But it's really not. It's more of a sort of trying to understand the implications of the fact that our personalities, our feelings about our lives could be so influenced by, by a drug that changes something about serotonergic transmission. I would say it's pretty agnostic on the subject of whether non-depressed people taking SSRIs is a good thing or not. Clearly, he's all in favor of depressed people taking antidepressant medication or getting some kind of therapy. The other thing about this book is that the patients, the non-depressed patients who chose to remain on SSRIs despite not meeting diagnostic criteria for depression, were not like totally happy, well-adjusted people. Life was not hunky-dory for these people. They definitely had some personality traits, some mood issues, some ways of reacting to their world that caused them some distress. So in that sense, we're not talking here about a totally happy, well-adjusted, normal person being, quote unquote, better than happy, normal, and well-adjusted. We're talking, however, about people who probably don't meet diagnostic criteria for a psychological problem or a serious, psychiatric illness, choosing to treat themselves or enhance themselves with SSRIs. Certainly people who 20 or 30 years ago would not have met diagnostic criteria for any kind of psychiatric disorder, choosing to take this psychiatric medication because it made them feel better. And the thing to note here is the fuzzy and moving line between therapy and enhancement. So, among the indications for certain SSRI drugs now are premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is basically, you know, a very bad form of PMS and sort of the you know, premenstrual blues, premenstrual irritability. For people who have an extreme version of that, that is now a diagnosis, and it's treatable with Prozac. But you know, 30 years ago, they would not have been considered sick. Okay. Similarly, social anxiety disorder, a kind of extreme and you know, in some situations, you know, crippling form of shyness. Again, 30 years ago, these patients would not have been considered sick. They wouldn't have met diagnostic criteria. And yet, they are now treated with SSRIs to pretty good effect, I gather. Now, it's interesting that they are now treated with these drugs and they now qualify for a diagnosis. And a lot has been written and said about the relationship between the availability of drugs to treat a condition, or, you know, the responsiveness of a condition or a symptom or set of symptoms to a drug, and the diagnostic boundaries that you know, are adopted, you know, in each new edition of the DSM. You know, it is said, I think pretty plausibly, that probably one reason that milder and milder kinds of mood disorders are considered diagnoses now is that doctors have a medicine that they can offer that may be effective, that doesn't have as bad side effects as the older generation of antidepressants had. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know. I mean, to some people it is an indication that you know, medical practice is being distorted by drug companies and their products and their marketing. The point I just want to make here, rather than take a position on those questions, is just that the line between what's normal and what's pathological, and hence the line between what's enhancement and what's therapy, is somewhat arbitrary and is somewhat fuzzy and moves over time, partly in response to what medical treatments are there. And I hasten to add that this is not just the result of, you know, psychiatry and psychology being kind of, you know, mixed up, screwed up fields that have no kind of objective criteria. You see the same phenomenon with such, you know, clear-cut medical conditions as hypertension, type 2 diabetes. It's, you know, the medical establishment decides on a dividing line between blood pressures that are going to be considered normal and blood pressures that are going to be considered hypertension. Blood sugars that are going to be considered normal and blood sugars that are going to be considered diabetes. And here, you know, lists of symptoms and ratings of severity that are considered normal and not normal. So, you know, we've seen that, that SSRIs, which which are taken because of their effect on mood, and to an extent, I think one can say personality, insofar as personality has to do with your characteristic ways of reacting emotionally to events and people and problems and challenges, that the SSRIs, which affect personality and mood, can be considered therapy or enhancement, depending on where you want to draw the line between illness and health. But clearly, some not so terribly sick people, by yesterday's standards, are using these drugs. So how do they work? You know, do they work as enhancers with normal people, and what do they do to achieve their effect? Well, just as I showed you the little picture of dopamine pathways in the last lecture, here is a picture of the serotonin pathways. And as you can see, again, it's all over the place, which might well lead you to expect that, you know, despite the first S, which is for selective, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, these drugs have very widespread effects. I mean, they affect, you know, appetite, they affect sexual function, they affect, you know, digestion. I mean, there's a lot of effects in addition to their effects on mood. And furthermore, their effects on mood appear not to be a direct result of the way in which they change serotonergic transmission, but something that happens downstream, perhaps neurogenesis in the hippocampus, but their effects are not well understood, which is often the case in psychopharmacology. There is an indication that they may be more effective for severe depression than mild depression. This is work, as I'm sure you know, that came out of our department. Jay Fournier, one of your colleagues in graduate school here, and Rob DeRubis, his advisor on the faculty in psychology, concluded from a meta-analysis that there was you know, pretty clear evidence that they were helpful for severely depressed patients, but for mildly depressed patients, they did not find effectiveness. I'm sure there's a lot more back and forth and further investigation before the dust settles on all of this. And as already noted, other kinds of what could be considered mild conditions, certainly conditions other than major depression, like social anxiety, like premenstrual dysphoric disorder, appear to be, I'm told, effectively treated by SSRIs. But in addition to the question of true enhancement for somebody who is, you know, normal as normal can be, you know, psychiatrically squeaky clean, which is probably not normal. We all have problems of some sort. But there actually is a little bit of data on how these drugs do affect completely normal people. The most detailed, and I think most interesting of these studies was done by Brian Knutson at Stanford quite a few years ago. And he gave a group of normal subjects paroxetine, Paxil, for I believe 3 weeks. So it was you know, chronic dosing. You know, unlike the stimulants where you take a pill and an hour later it has its effect. With the SSRIs, typically the mood effects do not kick in for, you know, something like 3 weeks. So these subjects were taking their Paxil every day, and he collected mood ratings and you know, various other indications of psychological well-being, mood, feeling. He also put the subjects in a sort of cooperative problem-solving situation in the lab, and coded their various utterances and behaviors to see how the drug might actually affect social behavior. And what he found in these two graphs is that the higher, I'm clearly wrong that it was a 3-week study, because these are data from week 4, so it was at least 4 weeks in duration. What he found was that the higher the blood levels of SSRI after 4 weeks, the how does this work? The lower the, oh my goodness, can somebody explain this to me? It looks like on the left?
With increased levels of the SSRI, you see reduced negative affect and increased affiliative behaviors.
Well, but hang on. The y-axis on that left-hand graph is change in negative affect. That's what I'm puzzled about. I also thought it was negative affect. So negative affect goes down when plasma SSRI goes up. Maybe it's a signed change. So
negative number.
Negative numbers, yeah. Okay, so it is signed. Yeah. Okay. So so the bigger negative change. Okay, right. So going from placebo to paroxetine. The bigger negative change in negative affect, that is, the bigger the drop in negative affect, the higher your blood levels. So that is, in other words, consistent with the idea that the drug in normal, healthy volunteers reduces negative affect. Similarly, on the right-hand panel, you see that the higher the blood level of the drug, the bigger the change in affiliative behavior in this cooperative problem-solving task. So the more likely a person is to make a request or a suggestion as opposed to issue a command, the less likely somebody is to just grab a puzzle piece from their puzzle-solving partner. So these are changes in mood and personality in squeaky clean normal subjects that are quite clearly related in a dose-response manner to the SSRI. Okay, so we see that there are subtle effects of SSRIs on mood and personality, but they are subtle. Given the side effects, expense, and so forth, to my knowledge, normal, happy, healthy people are not taking SSRIs. What might they take to lift mood and brighten personality? Well, there actually are some drugs that do these things, do them very effectively, do not require chronic dosing. You take a pill and an hour later you are feeling happier, acting more cheerful, and so forth. The problem is these are the pills that became notorious in the 50s and 60s for being highly addictive. So these are the mother's little helpers, and you all know the Rolling Stones take on this. Kids are different today, I hear every mother say. Mother needs something today to calm her down. And though she's not really ill, there's a little yellow pill. She goes running for the shelter of a mother's little helper, and it helps her on her way, gets her through her busy day. Okay, the medicalization of the frustrations of being a housewife in the 50s and 60s. They make you feel better, and these mothers did find that they short-term solved various kinds of problems. Long-term, they created problems, and this is why by the time the 70s rolled around, doctors had stopped prescribing them to people. Just a little aside, SSRIs, this huge class of drugs that we think of as antidepressants, and a lot of the money that various big drug companies are making, they're making from SSRIs. They are used to treat anxiety as well as depression. And when they were first being developed, drug companies were thinking of them as new anti-anxiety agents. But they decided to market them as antidepressants in part because they were afraid that the prescribers, that obviously drive the sales, were so burned by seeing patients get addicted to the earlier generation of anti-anxiety drugs that they would be slow to try the SSRIs. And so they decided instead to sort of identify them primarily as antidepressants, and accompanied that decision with a big marketing campaign to raise awareness of depression. Anyway, what I want to show you is some advertisements from the 50s and 60s and ones as late as 1970 from medical journals for these drugs, because you know, it's exactly like the Rolling Stones lyrics. Okay, so you probably cannot read these, so I'm going to read this aloud. Syndromes of the 60s, the battered parent syndrome. She's the paradox of our age. Compared to her mother, she has more education, more usable income, and more labor-saving devices. Yet she is physically and emotionally overworked, overwrought, and, by the time you see her, probably overwhelmed. What went wrong? Is parenthood something other than the rosy fulfillment pictured by the women's magazines? Is anxiety and tension fast becoming the occupational disease of the homemaker? Some say it's unrealistic to educate a woman and then expect her to be content with the Cub Scouts as an intellectual outlet, or to grant that she is socially, politically, and culturally equal while continuing to demand domestic and biological subservience, or to expect her to shoulder the guilt burden of this child-centered age without unraveling around the emotional edges, or to compete with her husband's job for his time and involvement. But whatever the cause, the consequences, anxiety, tension, insomnia, functional disorders, fill waiting rooms. Sometimes it helps to add Milltown to her treatment to help her relax both emotional and muscular tension. It's no substitute for a week in Bermuda or for emotional readjustment, but it will often make the latter easier for her, as well as for the physician. And Milltown has been doing just that for a dozen years now with substantial success. I mean, can you believe that? Amazing. So that's from the 1960s. This is, I believe, a 50s ad, and I can't read it because the print is too fine on my screen. Okay, here's, if the other ones were clearly aimed at women, this one is aimed at men, although it's probably the most misogynistic of all of them. Women dominate his universe. Psychic tension can rule his life. He doesn't understand the source of his psychic tension, but you do. He relates well to women with domineering traits, but not to men, not even his own son. Whenever psychic tension is a significant component in the clinical profile, consider the use of Valium. On proper maintenance dosage, Valium can help reduce the psychoneurotic patient's tension, anxiety, apprehension, agitation, alone or with depressive symptoms, to more comfortable and adaptable levels, blah, 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 blah. So, these really are the, mother and henpecked fathers little helpers. Unfortunately, I think we're still seeking a pill that will brighten our personality, raise our mood, without, being addictive. The SSRIs, just to recap, have very subtle effects on most normal, healthy people. And these drugs, although they'll make you feel great in the short term, they are likely to cause problems in the long term. Okay, so let's go to the ethical, legal, and social issues here. Well, as with the cognitive enhancers, we have, issues of safety, again, addiction, issues of fairness. Mood and personality tend not to be viewed as positional goods, that is to say, it doesn't really matter competitively whether you're cheerier or less cheery, although I think probably for certain kinds of occupations it may. But I think that many of our intuitions about the pros and cons of the personality enhancers and the cognitive enhancers have to do with just desserts, as we mentioned in the last lecture. You want to earn your happiness in the case of mood and personality enhancement. The writer Francis Fukuyama, in his book Our Post-Human Future, really goes on a rant about SSRIs and self-esteem, and says, So they improve people's self-esteem, but should we be doing that for people who don't necessarily deserve to feel good about themselves? I put that out there as one perspective on the issue. They also, oh, and freedom as well, I think. You could imagine, again, because of, you know, the desirability of cheeriness, you could imagine a boss pressuring an employee to get on one of these drugs. But I think for the personality and mood enhancement, the bigger issues really do focus on these issues of, you know, what I've called personhood, and specifically on identity and authenticity. So let's first think about identity. You know, who are you? And are you the same person on the drug and off? You know, are you being to thine own self true if you decide to sort of give up your gloomy perspective on things and, you know, use SSRI, you know, rose coloring on your glasses? I have a friend who was dating a woman for quite a while. It was a very stormy relationship. You know, he was just about to give up on it, and she went on an SSRI and became a lot more pleasant. I mean, she was a difficult person. She, you know, just kind of tended to see, you know, kind of small slights as, you know, evidence of, you know, terrible hostility, and small kind of acts of thoughtlessness as, you know, evidence that, you know, this guy, you know, was selfish and brutal and didn't care about her at all, and, you know, everything always got blown up. And when she went on her drug, things got so much better in this relationship. And that's when he decided that he would actually like to get married. And we were joking about, you know, should there be a prenuptial agreement that says she has to stay on the drug, right? And in the end, they didn't do that. You know, it raises the question, you know, who does he love, or who does he want to marry? Does he want to marry, you know, is it a different person? The person on Zoloft and off. You know, which one does he love? Does he love them both? But, you know, whatever. There is also a sense of, you know, so the idea of authenticity is partly related to identity. You know, are you your true self, or are you some kind of medicated artificial self? And interestingly, you know, as Kramer mentions in that one quote I showed you at the beginning, some patients have the intuition that they are more themselves on the drug, that it's kind of like, this is who I was meant to be. But not all of them did. So he also quotes people who say, well, you know, I feel like my true self was that kind of grouchy, uptight person, but I'd rather be this version of me now with the help of the drug. But there's another way in which authenticity comes in that's not so much related to your personal identity as to your relationship with reality. You know, is there a sense in which the drug is making you feel better because it's distorting your perception of reality? You know, is it giving you rose-colored glasses? And again, I think, you know, these issues apply not to, you know, perfectly happy, you know, the psychiatrically squeaky clean people, but for people who, you know, just have, you know, an assortment of hang-ups and angsts, and you know, maybe they're a little neurotic or whatever. So they are helped, and, you know, you can you can argue about whether that should be called treatment or enhancement. But for these people, certainly some people do not want to get treated because of concerns about their authentic selves and their connection to reality. But even the thought of, even setting that aside, there is a concern that if a drug makes you feel like the world is a nicer place and you're happier to be there, should you worry that, well, I'm happy, but is this some kind of false, picture of reality that that isn't real? And you think of in the book 1984, the drug Soma, which sort of made people happily kind of unbothered by the horrible world that they were forced to live in by this authoritarian regime. Should we worry that these drugs could sort of blunt our kind of right and proper reactions of being unhappy with a world that has cruelty and injustice and so forth in it? Okay. Well, so I think the final consideration for ethical, legal, and social issues is the question of should we even be debating to enhance or not to enhance? I mean, in some sense, it's here now. It's clearly showing a trend towards increasing. So maybe I think this is a quote from Star Trek. Is it Star Trek? Yeah, resistance is futile, right? I think, my advice to you neuroscience graduate students learning neuroethics is, study the arguments, pro and con enhancement for the insights that these arguments give you into the ways in which using enhancement of cognition and of mood and personality will change ourselves and change our world. But don't be fooled into thinking that the choice is really up to us. You guys are going to be the neuroscientists. You guys are not going to be the dictators of the world who get to say whether people use it or not. It is in our nature. The human species has from the start been making tools, been changing the environment, and finally changing ourselves. And we can't stop that. What we can try to do as scientists and as citizens is to try to guide these processes, this trend towards enhancement in in ways that will benefit the most people, that will avoid the worst risks, and just try to kind of foster the most beneficial outcome to this progression. I want to end with a description of a cartoon which I searched and searched online and could not find, and I emailed the author whose book I saw it in to ask him to send it to me. Haven't heard back yet. So I'm gonna describe what is essentially a visual joke, but I think it's a very profound one, and a apt note to end on. So imagine a staircase leading up, and on the lowest step, there's some kind of, I don't know, like, sea creature, sea slug looking thing. The next step up, there's some kind of a creature that has like legs, some land creature. The next step up is some more advanced, sort of mammalian looking creature. One step higher is, let's say an ape. Step after that is, some Cro-Magnon type looking caveman, okay? The next step up is, modern man, with a jacket and tie holding a briefcase and looking ahead at the steps in front of him with a kind of look of surprise on his face. And the word bubble comes from, I guess maybe the ape talking to the Cro-Magnon man or something, saying, I was wondering when he was going to notice those other steps. So.